It felt like the entire country was holding its breath the day Senator JD Vance walked into that packed courtroom. The marble floors, the heavy oak benches, the microphones lined up like silent witnesses, all waiting for the moment when words would turn into something heavier. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but everyone knew they were out there, waiting, humming, ready to break every sentence into clips for the evening news. Vance wasn't there by choice, but by duty. That's what he told himself as he straightened his tie, stepped through the door, and saw Judge Hollister already seated, leaning back in his chair with that smirk people in the courthouse had seen one too many times. The smirk of a man who thought the robe made him untouchable, who thought the gavel was a scepter, not a tool. The air was thick, buzzing, as the judge leaned forward, the microphone catching the sarcasm dripping from every word. "Ah, Senator Vance," he said, his lips curling around the title like it was a joke. "Gracing us with your presence, are you? I assume you believe your time is more valuable than ours." A murmur passed through the room. The senator's legal team glanced at each other, measuring the judge's tone, but JD didn't flinch. He just sat down, placed his hands calmly on the table, and met the judge's stare with a calmness that wasn't arrogance, but something steadier, like steel under pressure. The judge wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for a stage. Ignoring the normal decorum, he kept speaking, his voice low but sharp, so that everyone had to lean forward to catch the words. "Tell me, Senator, do you believe laws apply only to the common folk, or do you think your title grants you immunity?" Someone gasped, quietly, as if they were embarrassed for the judge. JD's eyes didn't flicker. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and spoke with the same voice he used back in Ohio, talking to folks over coffee, the kind of voice that carried weight because it didn't need to be loud. "Your Honor," he said, "I'm here to comply with the law, just like any citizen." The judge scoffed, leaning back, waving a dismissive hand. "That remains to be seen." He turned to the prosecutor with a sharp nod, and the questioning began. But it wasn't questioning, it was a performance. Every time JD tried to answer, the judge cut in, dismissing the words before they could form fully, shaking his head, smirking, glancing toward the gallery as if seeking validation from the whispers and the shifting eyes. JD's attorney stood up, his voice steady, respectful, but firm. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my client has the right to complete his statements." The judge's smirk widened, almost enjoying the moment, tapping his gavel once. "Oh, does he?" he said, his eyebrows raised. "I wasn't aware Senator Vance needed a personal speech podium in my courtroom." A few people in the back chuckled, but it was a nervous kind of laughter, the kind that dies quickly in the air when you realize it's not actually funny. JD remained composed, his hands still, his breathing steady, refusing to be baited. The judge wasn't finished. "Perhaps you'd prefer to run your own courtroom, Senator," the judge continued, his voice growing colder. "Maybe Congress has taught you that rules are optional." He banged the gavel again, harder this time, the echo snapping through the room, making people jump in their seats. The prosecutor hesitated, shifting uncomfortably, glancing at the judge as if questioning the strategy now. But it was too late. The tension was already thick, and it was only getting heavier. JD's legal team whispered among themselves, quick conversations about next steps, about objections, about the careful dance of defending without provoking further. But before they could act, the judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, his voice dropping low, heavy with threat. "Enough of this nonsense," he snapped. "Senator Vance, you are dangerously close to contempt." JD's attorney stood again, voice even firmer now. "Your Honor, respectfully, my client has done nothing to warrant such a claim." But the judge wasn't interested in reason. His jaw tightened, his eyes sharp. "If I say it's contempt, it is." He gestured sharply to the bailiff standing near the door. "Prepare to take this man into custody." The words hit the room like a hammer. Gasps, whispers, the sound of shifting feet as the bailiffs moved, the heavy doors swinging open as security personnel stepped forward. The air felt like it thinned out, every breath a little harder as the room braced for something unthinkable. JD raised his hands slightly, palms open, not in surrender, but in caution. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but clear, "I'd advise you to reconsider. This is a courtroom, not a monarchy." The judge sneered, leaning back as if insulted by the very idea. "Your arrogance is astounding, Senator," the judge spat, his face reddening. "I won't tolerate defiance in my courtroom." He turned back to the bailiffs, his hand waving downward. "Cuff him." The bailiffs stepped forward, the sound of their boots heavy on the floor, the cuffs glinting in the fluorescent lights. But before they could reach JD, a voice cut through the tension. "Your Honor." A court officer stepped forward, urgency in every step, in every word. The judge's eyes flashed with annoyance, but he waved the officer closer. They spoke in hushed tones, the courtroom holding its collective breath, trying to catch a word, a phrase, anything. The officer's face grew serious, and the judge's confidence started to slip, just a fraction, but enough for people to see it. The officer handed the judge a document, a thick file with the seal of the Department of Justice on the cover. The judge's eyes scanned the first page, then the second, his fingers tightening on the edge of the paper. Whatever was in that file, it was heavy enough to shake him. The judge swallowed, clearing his throat, trying to find the arrogance he had worn like a second skin just moments before. "Senator Vance," he said, his voice quieter now. "It appears there has been a development." He paused, the room silent, the moment stretching thin. "You are free to go." The words hung in the air, disbelief etching itself onto every face in the room. Even JD's legal team seemed frozen, blinking, processing what had just happened. JD adjusted his suit jacket, stood slowly, and nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his tone measured, not triumphant, just steady. He turned to leave, taking a step toward the aisle, but paused, looking back over his shoulder. Perhaps next time, impartiality will be more than just a word in this courtroom. The judge's jaw clenched, his lips pressed tight, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. JD walked out, the reporters outside scrambling, the flashes of cameras lighting up the cold afternoon. "Senator, how do you feel about what just happened?" one shouted. JD paused, the corners of his mouth turning into a small, knowing smirk. "I think the law speaks for itself." And he kept walking, leaving behind a courtroom that was still reeling, still trying to catch up with the moment that had just unfolded. But the story wasn't over. The judge sat there gripping the file, his hands shaking, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an exit that wasn't there. The court officer who had handed him the file didn't leave. He stood there watching, waiting. "We need to talk, Your Honor," he said, his voice calm, but with an authority that cut through the heavy silence. The judge looked up, swallowing hard, nodding, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. Minutes later, the same bailiffs who had been ordered to arrest JD Vance walked back toward the bench. "Your Honor," one of them said, his voice steady, "you need to come with us." The judge blinked, confusion and disbelief mixing on his face. "Excuse me?" The bailiff didn't waver, didn't look away. "Judge Raymond Hollister, you are being placed under arrest for judicial misconduct and abuse of power." The words fell into the room like a stone into still water, the ripples immediate and unstoppable. The judge's face drained of color, his lips parting, a protest on the edge of his tongue. "Wait, this is absurd," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I was simply maintaining order." The bailiff shook his head. "Your actions have been reviewed, and an independent investigation has found cause for your removal." The gavel slipped from the judge's fingers, clattering against the wood of the bench, rolling, falling off the edge, landing on the floor with a sound that echoed in the stunned silence. The bailiff stepped forward, pulling out the handcuffs, the metal clicking as they locked into place. "Please stand, Your Honor." The irony was thick, hanging in the air as the judge, once so sure of his power, shook his head. "This is outrageous," he whispered. "I am the law in this courtroom." "Not anymore," the bailiff said, his voice calm, even, final. The cuffs clicked closed around the judge's wrists, sealing the moment, sealing the judge's fate. The room stayed silent, the only sounds the heavy breathing of those witnessing history, the soft steps of the officers as they led the judge away, his robe hanging loose, no longer a symbol of power, but a reminder of what had been lost. Outside, JD Vance stood before the cameras, his face clear, his words steady. "This is what happens when power goes unchecked," he said, looking directly into the lenses, into the eyes of the country watching from living rooms, break rooms, phone screens. No one, not even a judge, is above the law. And as the cameras flashed, as the reporters shouted, as the country watched, the message was clear. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about power. It was about accountability. And for once, the system listened. JD didn't celebrate that day. He didn't go out for a victory dinner. He didn't call the cameras for a triumphant speech on the courthouse steps. He just got in the car, shut the door, and sat there for a moment, the quiet pressing in as his team climbed in one by one, the doors closing with soft, final thuds. His attorney, a wiry man with gray hair and glasses that slipped down his nose when he was nervous, cleared his throat. "You handled that well, Senator." JD just stared out the window for a moment before looking back. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice low, calm, but with something tired beneath it. He did. They pulled away from the courthouse, the crowds thinning behind them, the echoes of camera shutters and shouted questions fading into the hum of the engine. Outside, the city was just going on with its day. People crossing streets, coffee in hand, kids walking with backpacks, construction workers shouting over the roar of machinery. For them, the courthouse was just another building. But inside, something had shifted. The news broke within the hour. First local affiliates, then the major networks. The judge's arrest, the footage of him being led out of the courtroom, cuffs glinting, eyes down, was replayed again and again, the anchors talking over the images, analyzing every detail, every gesture. Judge Raymond Hollister, long known for his aggressive courtroom demeanor, was arrested today on charges of judicial misconduct and abuse of power. This shocking turn of events comes after a heated exchange with Senator JD Vance. The arrest was the culmination of an investigation quietly conducted by the Department of Justice. Questions are now being raised about past rulings under Judge Hollister's tenure. Social media was a wildfire. Clips of JD's calm words, the judge's angry sneer, the moment the cuffs clicked shut, all sliced into 30-second reels, stitched over commentary, debate, outrage. Had no one above the law started trending within hours. Teachers shared it, veterans, small business owners, people who'd never voted for JD Vance but found themselves nodding at the simple truth of it. No one is above the law, not even a judge. And in living rooms across the country, families paused mid-bite during dinner, watching the news, the kids asking, "What happened?" And parents trying to explain that sometimes even the people who are supposed to uphold the law can break it. And when they do, they have to answer for it. In small towns, people leaned over diner counters, coffee cups in hand, shaking their heads. "About time," someone would mutter, and others would nod. In state capitals, in Washington backrooms, the story was different. Phones rang, aides whispered, meetings were called. JD's name, already a fixture in political circles, now carried a new weight. He stood his ground. He didn't take the bait. He let the judge hang himself. But JD wasn't thinking about that. He wasn't thinking about polls or the next election. He was thinking about the judge's face, the moment the arrogance cracked, the fear, the realization. And he was thinking about what it meant. Days passed, but the story didn't die down. If anything, it grew. Investigations opened into Judge Hollister's previous cases. Lawyers started reviewing transcripts. Clients came forward, whispering stories of intimidation, threats, outcomes that didn't make sense. The local bar association issued statements, distancing themselves from the judge they had once praised. JD was called in for interviews, but he kept them short. "I didn't go there to fight with the judge," he said in one. "I went there to tell the truth." That clip too went viral. People liked its simplicity. No slogans, no grandstanding, just a straightforward statement that felt rare in a world addicted to drama. Meanwhile, in the courthouse, the atmosphere changed. The heavy hush of fear that had followed Judge Hollister like a shadow lifted. Clerks spoke more freely. Bailiffs didn't flinch at every command. Attorneys felt like they could breathe in the hallways again. The judge's office, once a fortress, was sealed for investigation. Boxes were carried out, files examined, and every piece of evidence was cataloged meticulously. They found notes that hinted at bias, at deals cut behind closed doors, at a man who believed the robe protected him from the consequences of his actions. And the country watched. JD returned to Ohio, back to the neighborhoods where people didn't care much about DC drama unless it touched their lives. But this time, it had. The conversations at the barbershop, the questions at the grocery store, the nods of strangers in the street. Good job out there. About time someone stood up to them. Thanks for not backing down. It wasn't about politics, it wasn't about parties. It was about something older, deeper. The sense that the system only works when people are willing to hold the line, even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable. At home, JD sat with his wife over coffee, the kids asleep upstairs, the house quiet in that precious window of calm before dawn. "You okay?" she asked him, reaching across the table to touch his hand. He nodded, but his eyes were distant. "It's just," he started, then stopped, searching for the words. "It's just that it shouldn't take this much to do the right thing," he finished. She squeezed his hand, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say. In DC, the aftermath continued. Congressional hearings were called. Experts testified about judicial accountability, about the dangers of unchecked power, about the importance of oversight. JD was there, not as a headline, but as a participant, asking questions, listening, taking notes. He didn't speak much, but when he did, the room got quiet. "What are we going to do?" he asked one panel, "to make sure this doesn't happen again?" The experts shifted, papers rustled, the cameras clicked, because it was the question that mattered. It was the question everyone was afraid to answer, because the answer meant work, meant change, meant uncomfortable conversations about power and responsibility. And somewhere, in a federal holding facility, Raymond Hollister sat alone in a small room, staring at the wall, the robe he once wore now replaced with a standard-issue jumpsuit. The world he had ruled from his bench was gone, replaced by the reality he had once inflicted on others. He was awaiting trial now, his lawyers working through the night, arguing about bail, about conditions, about charges that carried heavy sentences. The reporters tried to get statements, but the judge had nothing to say. His silence was loud, echoing through the halls of a justice system that was trying to reckon with its own failings. The months passed, but the lesson didn't fade. It was repeated on talk shows, podcasts, news segments. No one is above the law, and it was JD's name attached to it, but he never claimed it as a victory. He went back to work, back to legislation, back to the everyday grind of serving the people who had sent him to DC in the first place. People tried to make it political, but it wasn't. It was a reminder that sometimes the system works. Sometimes when someone refuses to back down, refuses to get angry, refuses to be baited, the truth can stand on its own. And it did. In small courtrooms across America, the ripple effects of Hollister's fall were felt in whispers. Judges who had once emulated his harsh, performative style suddenly adjusted their tone, glancing over their benches at attorneys with a flicker of caution. Bailiffs who once moved quickly under shouted orders now paused, waiting for calm directions. And it wasn't fear that caused the change. It was awareness. If it could happen to Hollister, it could happen to anyone who forgot why they wore the robe in the first place. Clerks in dusty record rooms, sorting stacks of yellowing files, found themselves looking at old rulings with fresh eyes. Had they missed something? Had they stamped approvals on paperwork that needed a second look? In state bars and legal panels, young lawyers felt emboldened, telling stories in low voices of moments when they had been berated in court, silenced for asking for fairness, humiliated for standing up for a client. They wondered aloud if Hollister's arrest was a signal that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to accept that treatment anymore. JD didn't take victory laps, but he took meetings. Community leaders called, asking if he could explain what happened. Parents in school gyms, veterans in community halls, small business owners at local chambers of commerce. They didn't want grand speeches. They wanted to understand. How does something like that happen? JD would take a sip of water, nod, and answer calmly. It happens when power is left unchecked. It happens when people are afraid to speak up because they think it won't matter. It happens when we forget that the system is supposed to serve the people, not the other way around. And then he would pause, looking around the room, locking eyes with the people who had come to listen, and add, "But it stops when we remember who's really in charge. You are." That line would stick with people long after they left those meetings, driving home in the quiet, headlights washing over lonely back roads, the radio off, thinking about how that courtroom, that judge, that moment had cracked something open. The media, hungry for a new angle, started digging deeper. They uncovered stories of small-time defendants who had stood before Judge Hollister, shaking, stumbling over words, trying to explain themselves as the judge mocked them, dismissed them, handed down maximum sentences for minor infractions. They interviewed a single mother who had cried on the courthouse steps after losing custody in a rushed hearing, the judge rolling his eyes as she tried to speak. They found transcripts where he had cut off public defenders mid-sentence, scolding them for wasting the court's time when they tried to present mitigating evidence. And people watched. They watched from hospital waiting rooms, from break rooms on lunch, from phones on subway rides home. They shook their heads, some in anger, some in sadness, some with a glimmer of hope that the exposure meant things might change. In Washington, the political class tried to absorb the lessons in real time. Senators JD didn't always agree with, who had debated him across committee tables, pulled him aside in hallways, lowering their voices. "Good job," they'd say, with a nod, then walk away. Others tried to spin it for their causes, but JD avoided the noise. He knew what it was about, and he refused to let it become anything else. He wasn't a hero, he'd tell people privately. He was just a man who hadn't backed down when it would have been easier to shut up, to nod, to take the abuse and let the moment pass. He had stood his ground, and the truth had done the rest. Meanwhile, Judge Hollister's case advanced. The man who once ran his courtroom with iron certainty now found himself in hearings, wearing a suit but looking smaller each time he appeared, his shoulders hunched, eyes darting around the room. He wasn't in control anymore. The system he had bent to his will was now working exactly as it should, and it was working on him. Prosecutors, some of whom had once feared his temper, now presented evidence methodically, professionally, without hesitation. Witnesses stepped forward. Lawyers, former defendants, even clerks, speaking of moments when Hollister had overstepped, when he had let ego and arrogance override justice. And JD watched from afar, not with joy, but with the quiet satisfaction that accountability was happening. It wasn't just about Hollister. It was about what came next. JD's office received letters, hundreds of them, from people who felt seen, who felt heard, veterans who had faced harsh sentencing for minor charges, single mothers who had been humiliated in custody hearings, small business owners who had been berated over paperwork errors. They didn't all live in JD's state. Many wrote from across the country, some from small towns he'd never heard of. They weren't asking for handouts. They weren't asking for speeches. They were saying, "Thank you for standing up. Thank you for reminding us that the law is supposed to protect us, not crush us. Thank you for not letting him get away with it." JD read every letter, some late at night, in the glow of a single lamp, the house quiet, the world outside dark and still, and each letter was a reminder of why he had gone to DC in the first place. In classrooms across the country, high school government teachers used the story as a real-time lesson. "This is why we have checks and balances," one teacher said, pointing to the headline on the projector. "This is why no one is supposed to be above the law," another explained to a group of sleepy juniors, some of whom looked up from their phones long enough to nod. It was a story that was easy to understand, even for those who didn't care much for politics. A judge who abused his power, a man who stood up calmly, refused to back down, and watched as the truth did its work. News networks eventually moved on, as they always do. Other stories took over the cycle: international crises, economic shifts, new political scandals. But in the quiet, the impact of what happened in that courtroom didn't fade. It lingered in the minds of those who had watched it happen live, in the homes of Americans who had felt powerless, in the break rooms where workers had debated whether it was worth speaking up the next time their boss crossed the line. Because sometimes, all it takes is one moment to remind people that standing up matters. Sometimes, all it takes is one man refusing to bow his head when he knows he's right. Sometimes, that's enough to crack the dam, to let the truth spill out. Outside the courthouse where it had all begun, tourists now stopped to take photos, sometimes asking the officers on duty, "Is this where that judge was arrested?" They'd nod, and the tourists would shake their heads, smiling, taking their selfies before moving on. And the officers, once under Hollister's glare, now stood a little taller. They asked JD if he felt vindicated, if seeing the judge in handcuffs had given him satisfaction. He would pause before answering.
"It's not about me," he'd say. "It's about making sure people remember that the system can work, but it only works if we demand it does." Sometimes he'd add quietly, "And it's about reminding folks that silence is expensive." In coffee shops, barber shops, and union halls, people debated the story. They talked about how it felt to watch a man in power face the consequences of his actions, live without spin, without delay. "It's about time someone like that got held accountable," an older man in Kentucky said, flipping through a paper. A young woman in Chicago replied, "It's not just about him. It's about every system that needs to remember who it's supposed to serve." Across the country, the moment became a quiet rallying point for those who felt forgotten. In the weeks that followed, legal reform groups used the case as a springboard. They organized town halls titled No One Above the Law, bringing in speakers. Some of them people who had faced judges like Hollister, others who had fought and won small but significant victories in their communities. Lawyers shared practical advice: how to document judicial misconduct, what to do when you feel you've been unfairly treated in court, how to contact oversight boards. Community members who had never attended civic meetings before began to show up, asking questions, sharing stories. It wasn't a revolution, it wasn't flashy, but it was real. And in the back of those rooms, JD sometimes stood, arms crossed, just listening, a slight nod now and then, reminding himself that sometimes the biggest changes start small. Judge Hollister's trial became a spectacle, not because it was dramatic in the Hollywood sense, but because it was so quiet. The evidence was laid out piece by piece: transcripts of hearings where he had belittled defendants, recordings of moments when he had mocked attorneys for requesting fair hearings, financial records showing suspicious patterns in his handling of certain cases where campaign donors' businesses received favorable rulings. Each fact, each piece of evidence was like a drip of water against stone. The once powerful judge who had ruled with a sneer now sat silent, eyes darting, lips tightening, as former colleagues testified. A clerk told the court, "There were days I went home sick, knowing what I filed that day wasn't justice." A public defender recounted, "I would stay up all night preparing for hearings, knowing he would cut me off within minutes." A single mother, her voice shaking, said, "I begged him to let me speak, just to explain my situation. He rolled his eyes." And JD, watching from the gallery, saw in the faces of the jury the same realization that had come over the courtroom the day Hollister was arrested: the robe doesn't protect you from accountability. As the verdict neared, news outlets returned to the story. Cable pundits debated whether this case would change anything in the larger system. Was it a one-off? Would judges learn, or would they close ranks? JD was invited onto shows, but he chose his words carefully, avoiding theatrics. "If we let this moment pass without demanding accountability elsewhere, it will be just another headline," he told one host. "But if we remember it, if we insist on it, it can be the start of something bigger." The day the verdict was announced, the courtroom was full again. Families who had once stood before Hollister now came to see the end of his reign. Young lawyers came on their lunch breaks. Court officers stood quietly along the walls, their faces unreadable. When the jury foreman stood, the air was thick, the hush absolute. Guilty. On count after count, abuse of power, judicial misconduct, corruption, the verdict was the same: guilty. Hollister's shoulders slumped, the last of his defiance draining from his eyes. JD didn't cheer, no one did. But there was a collective exhale, like a storm had passed and the air was clean for the first time in a long while. After the verdict, a reporter caught JD outside the courthouse. "What would you say to Americans watching this who feel like the system is too big, too rigged to change?" she asked. JD looked into the camera, his face calm. "I'd say the system is big. It is messy. It will disappoint you sometimes, but it will only change if we demand it to. One courtroom, one judge, one moment at a time." Back in his office, JD sat quietly, looking at a small stack of letters from people who had written about the case. A handwritten note from a father who had regained custody of his kids after an unfair ruling had been overturned post-Hollister's arrest. A typed letter from a public defender who said she felt safer advocating for her clients now that judges were under more scrutiny. A message from a teenager who had watched the hearing online, writing, "I didn't think people in power could get in trouble like that. I want to be a lawyer now." JD folded that letter carefully, placing it in the top drawer of his desk. In the weeks that followed, state legislatures debated bills to strengthen judicial oversight. Citizen groups organized workshops on civic engagement. Law schools added discussions about the case to their ethics classes. It wasn't perfect. Change was slow, but it was happening. In homes across the country, people returned to their daily lives, but the image remained. A judge, handcuffed, led out of his own courtroom, not above the law. Parents cooking dinner looked at their kids and thought about the world they were leaving them. Workers on lunch break talked about standing up to unfair treatment. Students debated the story in government class, wondering how they could make a difference. And JD, in those quiet moments, reflected not on the drama of the day, but on the principle behind it. Power serves the people, and the people are watching. The cameras were still there when JD Vance stepped back outside, his suit jacket catching a slight breeze that lifted the tension just enough for the reporters to shout questions again. But Vance didn't stop. Not yet. Not while the world was still trying to understand how a single courtroom on a single morning had flipped the entire power structure on its head. Across America, people were re-watching the footage, the judge's smirk, the threats of contempt, the bailiff's approach, the quiet voice of the court officer interrupting the judge, and the moment those handcuffs clicked onto the wrists of the man who had believed himself untouchable. And JD Vance? He hadn't needed to raise his voice, hadn't needed to posture. The system had spoken for itself, and this time, for once, it had spoken honestly. But the story wasn't over, because what happened in that courtroom had started something bigger. In living rooms, on lunch breaks, in truck cabs, in classrooms, people were talking about it. Did you see that judge get taken down? Man, did you see Vance's face? He didn't even flinch. Is that what accountability looks like? They weren't asking about politics anymore. They were asking about justice, about systems that were supposed to protect them, but often failed. And now, for once, they saw a system crack open, if only for a moment, to swallow one of its own. News panels were stacked for days. Legal analysts debated whether the arrest would stand, whether the charges of judicial misconduct could lead to larger investigations, whether other judges across the country would take note. Does this set a precedent? One anchor asked. It might, a legal expert replied. It shows that no one, not even a judge, is above the law. But more importantly, it shows the public what's possible when due process is upheld without fear. Meanwhile, in Ohio, Vance returned to his office. The calls, the emails, the messages poured in. Some praising him for staying calm, others asking him what came next. And the truth was, he didn't know. Because this wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about a single judge who let arrogance override fairness. It was about a system that people were desperate to believe in again, but too often couldn't. Vance sat alone in his office that evening, the noise of the world buzzing beyond the window, replaying the moment in his mind when the judge realized the power had shifted. How quickly the arrogance had drained from the judge's face. How quickly the reality had set in. It was a reminder that power is only as strong as the people allow it to be. And the people? They were watching. They had seen a judge cross a line, seen a senator stand firm, seen accountability land in the one place it so rarely does, the people who think they're above it. It wasn't lost on Vance how rare that was. It wasn't lost on the public either. In the following weeks, deeper investigations into the judge's past cases began to surface. Whispers turned into headlines, stories of defendants mistreated, of bias unchecked, of small injustices piling up into large injustices because nobody had dared to question him. A local woman stepped forward, recalling a custody case where the judge had cut her off mid-sentence, mocking her lack of education while deciding her child's future in a single, impatient afternoon. A small business owner recounted a zoning dispute where the judge had rolled his eyes, silencing his attorney while siding with a large developer who contributed to a re-election fund. And each story fueled the fire. People weren't satisfied with one arrest. They wanted more. They wanted change. And Vance, for all his critics, had become a symbol in that moment. Not of a politician, not of a senator, but of a citizen who had faced down power and watched it crumble under the weight of its own arrogance. National papers ran opinion pieces. Is this the accountability we've waited for? Judges aren't untouchable. We just needed to remember. Cable networks shifted from outrage to analysis. Legal scholars debated the possibility of broader judicial oversight reform. And the judge? He was out on bail, but the robe was gone. The authority was gone. and the courtroom he had once ruled with sarcasm and ego was now a reminder of what happens when power forgets its purpose. One morning, a local news crew found him leaving his house, refusing to comment as cameras followed him to his car. His eyes, once sharp with smug confidence, darted away from the lenses. Inside that courtroom where it all happened, the staff tried to get back to normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. The bailiffs spoke in lower voices. The clerks exchanged glances they hadn't before. The walls themselves seemed to carry the memory of the day the judge was led away in cuffs. And the people of that town, and many towns like it, carried something too. A memory of the moment when justice looked different, when the system did what it was supposed to do. It became the kind of story parents told their kids. You see, even the powerful have to answer for their actions. It became the kind of story teachers used in civics classes, reminding students that public servant means exactly that. Serving the public, not ruling over them. It became the kind of story that whispered through late-night diners and barbershops, where people spoke quietly about how tired they were of being talked down to, brushed aside, silenced by those in robes, those behind benches, those with titles. And now they had seen it was possible to fight back. JD Vance knew the headlines would fade, the media would move on, but the people who saw it happen wouldn't forget. Because for once, the cameras didn't cut away when it got uncomfortable. For once, the spin wasn't fast enough to cover the truth, and for once, the truth was undeniable. JD Vance wasn't a hero. He didn't need to be. He was a witness to a moment when justice worked, when the system didn't bend to fear, when the rules applied to everyone. And that was enough, because in that single moment, in that single courtroom, a message was sent across the country. No one is above the law. Not a senator, not a judge, not anyone. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of story America needed to see. Days turned into weeks, and the ripples of that day continued to spread. A small town in Indiana decided to review the complaints lodged against their own judges. A state representative introduced a bill calling for mandatory cameras in all courtrooms, ensuring the public could see what happened in the rooms where their lives were decided. An advocacy group launched a hotline for citizens who felt mistreated by the legal system, inspired by the flood of stories that emerged after the judge's arrest. And across social media, the clip of the judge's arrest was shared millions of times, accompanied by a simple message: accountability, finally. JD Vance didn't take a victory lap. He didn't need to. He knew there would be more battles, more judges who forgot why they wore the robe, more moments where power needed to be reminded of its limits. But for that moment, he allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. Not because a judge had been arrested, but because for once the law had spoken clearly, without fear, without favoritism. And that, in a nation desperate for accountability, was a victory in itself.